Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Silk War, and today we're going to be talking about something a little different than usual. This will be more of a stream of consciousness type video where we're going to be reviewing WarcraftLogs and looking at how we can use this website to improve our DPS by comparing ourselves against the best Havoc Demon Hunters. So let's look at Sire Denathrius. This is one fight that I particularly struggle on. There are a lot of mechanics to pay attention to, and if you intend to stay alive the entire fight, you tend to sacrifice a lot of DPS. So here, let's look at this log. We're going to look at February 5th, which is the most recent log for Sire Denathrius. And we're going to scroll down here and look particularly at our DPS results. Now, you have a whole bunch of tabs at the top here where you can get a breakdown of all the information for this fight. If I want to look at damage taken, if I want to look at healing, threat, buffs, debuffs, deaths, dispels, resources casts, it's all there. Not to mention, you can look at different views than just what we're looking at here. You can look at tables, which is what we have, but you can look at timelines, you can look at events, you can look at queries, where you can just specifically ask about particular aspects of the fight. But for now, we're going to look at tables, which is the clearest and most concise view, I think. And it's the one that I typically use when reviewing my performance. Now, you can't compare something without something to compare against, right? So we're going to be looking at Sire Denathrius up here on the top left. We're looking at rankings. That's going to pull up a new tab. We are already looking at damage. Now we need to specify this is a heroic fight, so we're going to move down to heroic. Now we're going to look for particularly Havoc Demon Hunters. Now, as it stands, we are currently looking at Havoc Demon Hunter damage for heroic Sire Denathrius regardless of item level. But that doesn't really tell us what we're looking for. We want to know, for our current item level, what is the best performance we can possibly be getting? So let's look back at WarcraftLogs. Let's pull up this parse. We're going to look at our summary page here, where we have all the details on our stats, talents, soulbinds, gear, and most importantly, item level. So we see here we're at item level 218. We're going to go back here, and we're going to change our item level grouping to 218 to 220, where we are now looking at Havoc Demon Hunters who are on our item level. These are people who are doing achievable DPS. They have similar gear to us, so whatever they're doing because they're pressing their buttons in a better order, or they've selected better conduits, talents, trinkets, and so on. So, let's take a look at this. We first want to look at the overall distribution of talents. You can see the top 100 breakdown at the top of the page. For the first row of talents, Blind Fury is overwhelmingly selected. This is because this is a cleave fight, and as we've discussed in previous videos, Havoc Demon Hunters really have two core builds. There is a single target build which uses Fellblade and Demon Blades, and there is the multi-target build which uses Blind Fury and Insatiable Hunger. So, since this fight has a lot of adds, unsurprisingly, the overwhelming selection is indeed the cleave build. So, we're going to see Blind Fury up the top, Insatiable Hunger, Glaive Tempest. Now, this row is up to your preference, but I will say that Netherwalk is generally preferred for this fight, because Phase 1, the Night Hunter ability, you can use Netherwalk to mitigate the damage, much like a Hunter will use Turtle. So having that ability will prevent raid-wide damage from soaking the lines, which is generally preferable to having yourself healed with Leech throughout the fight. Then we have Cycle of Hatred at 95%. Master of the Glaive is the general preference here, although Unleash Power comes up as a close second. And finally, Demonic is the overwhelming preference because the Momentum build really hasn't picked up much traction. Now we've looked at the overall top 100 talents. Let's move down to trinkets. Now, trinkets are more of a long-term goal to fix. If you have the wrong trinkets, you're going to have to grind for days and days in Mythic Pluses and Raids to get the trinkets that you're looking for. So I wouldn't care too much about trinkets. Obviously, you can write them down, say, okay, File Putrefaction is ridiculously overpowered, so is Hateful Chain. These are things that you can note, but they aren't something you can immediately fix for parses that you're doing, say, this week or next week, right? So this is just something to keep in mind. Now, this last row is going to be talking about conduits. We don't get much information out of this section here because you see there are Venthyr conduits mixed up with Night Fae conduits, and if there were any other preference for Demon Hunter conduits, of course they'd be here too. Like Kyrian, for instance, is very rare, but they are there too. At this point, we want to be looking at particular Demon Hunters. So we're going to be looking at the #1 guy in our item level bracket to see what choices he's making. Now, he is Night Fae, so that's a thumbs up for us. We are Night Fae, perfect. Now we can see his talents, which he is running the Cleave build. He's using Soul Rending. Like I said, I'd prefer using Netherwalk, but that's up to personal preference, really. He does have the File Putrefaction and Skulker's Wing trinkets. But let's look at Soulbind. So he's running Grove Invigoration, Nature's Splendor, Naya's Tools Burrs, and Run Without Tiring. Now we're going to compare back on our summary page to our Soulbinds and Conduits. For our Soulbinds, we have Grove Invigoration, Naya's Tools Burrs, Nature's Splendor, and Run Without Tiring. So 4 for 4, we have all the same Soulbinds. Now we're going to be looking at Conduits. For Conduits, he's running Viscous Ink, Growing Inferno, Fell Defender, and Fellfire Haste. For us, we are running Viscous Ink, Fell Defender, Fellfire Haste, but we ran, for this parse, Relentless Onslaught. Now, if you're familiar with the Conduits, you'll see that this is particularly a single target conduit. What probably happened, I'll tell you, it definitely happened, is that I was too lazy to swap out my conduits for a particular raid fight, so I didn't. Now, if you want to maximize your parses, you really want to take that time to swap your conduits, because this is a terrible conduit to be taking in a cleave-centric build. If I was running the Growing Inferno, you can see it increases damage each time it ticks. So that's damage being increased to all the adds around you. So all those adds that spawn in Phase 1, all those adds that spawn in Phase 2 are now getting cleaved by Growing Inferno, and that is a huge amount of damage that we lost in our parse. The final thing we're going to be looking at is the Legendary. Here he is running Collective Anguish, which 97% of the top 100 Demon Hunters are running Collective Anguish, which makes sense. This is a cleave fight. Having the extra Demon Hunter, which is casting Fle Devastation, will definitely increase your damage much more than the single target Chaos Theory will. And you can see here, you can scroll down to gear, we are running Collective Anguish on the wrist. So that is perfect. Now we can look at the nitty-gritty details. This is where we have to pull up the specific log. We're going to have to translate it from Korean to English. One thing to note, which I didn't catch on the first run-through, is that this Demon Hunter is running with a high parsing group. The majority of the people in his group are parsing in the 90s, and as a result, it's going to condense the duration of the fight and enlarge their DPS numbers. So I wouldn't rely too much on DPS numbers in the raw, but I would still lean on the analysis of his percentages and how those percentages compare against our own. With that, let's get back to the video. And then go down and select this Havoc Demon Hunter from the list to get his full details. Looking at this side by side is the way that I typically like to do it, so we're going to pull this up on the right side of the screen, snap it in with Windows, pull up the left side, and let's look back at our summary page, and we're going to swap it to damage done. Now we can see side by side damage done for both of these players, right? Ourselves compared against this Korean player who was the #1 Havoc Demon Hunter in our item level bracket. And we can see a clear difference in the damage charts. First thing we want to look at is that shape, and you see that we have one huge spike in the beginning of our damage, followed by 2 tapered off spikes, and then one more huge spike for that 4th round of adds. Now, there are 4 add spawns in Phase 1 of Denathrius, assuming that your group has sufficient DPS to do it. And you can see, looking at this other Demon Hunter's DPS, his damage is spiking basically the same for each group of adds. Now what that tells me is that we really aren't maximizing our damage. Right off the bat, we know that our I-Beam and our Fle Devastation are the biggest chunk of AoE damage that Havoc Demon Hunters do, along with Glaive Tempest. And we can see that based on these spikes compared to our spikes, something is wrong in these middle two spikes. We are clearly not maximizing our damage on those add spawns with our I-Beam, with our Fle Devastation, or with our Glaive Tempest. But if we want to get into the specifics, we want to really know the root cause of these problems, we're going to have to look at the hard numbers on this. So let's scroll down and do a quick comparison, side by side. And we can see Glaive Tempest for us was right up at the top, right, with 23 casts throughout the fight. Now, one thing to note is that our fight lasted 2 minutes longer than their fight did. They capped off at about 5 minutes and 40 seconds, and we capped off at about 7 minutes and 40 seconds. So, for us to get 23 casts of Glaive Tempest, compared to their 21 casts of Glaive Tempest, tells us that we wasted about 2 minutes not casting Glaive Tempest. Because if there are 2 additional casts in 2 minutes' time, does that really make sense when Glaive Tempest has about a 10-second cooldown? No, it doesn't. I mean, clearly there were wasted points where Glaive Tempest came off cooldown and we weren't using it, and that results in a massive loss of DPS. Let's look at the DPS for Glaive Tempest. 934 over here compared to the 504 here. So that is a massive loss, and that's something that we need to pay attention to when doing Sire Denathrius, is maximizing that Glaive Tempest damage against those adds and lining it up with those add spawns to maximize their damage. Now, the next thing we look at is I-Beam. I-Beam is a very core ability for cleave fights. It is a huge damaging ability for Havoc Demon Hunters. And you can see that we got 16 casts off in 7 minutes 40 seconds. And for this Demon Hunter, he also got 16 casts off in 5 minutes and 40 seconds. So again, I-Beam is a 30-second cooldown. And this means that either we are not proccing often on our talent, which reduces the cooldown of our I-Beam, or the more likely case is that I-Beam came off cooldown and we were sitting on I-Beam and we should have been using it. And again, that results in a huge amount of DPS lost. Now, one thing we want to look at, since I-Beam is associated with Fle Devastation, is to also keep an eye on how Fle Devastation is ranking in our damage. Fle Devastation for us is doing 6% of our damage, whereas Fle Devastation for this Demon Hunter is doing upwards of 13% of their damage. This means that we are losing a huge amount of Fle Devastation damage, and this is important because it shows that we are mispositioning our I-Beam. Now, if you're familiar with the Fle Devastation legendary, the Fle Devastation will start wherever you're facing, but unlike your I-Beam where you can rotate after beginning the cast, the Fle Devastation is in a fixed position. Not to mention, Fle Devastation is a smaller area of effect in a small cone, whereas your I-Beam is much longer. So correctly positioning the Fle Devastation is very important for maximizing your DPS, and you can see that somewhere that we failed. Because even though we were getting a fair amount of damage out of our I-Beam, we were getting a much lower amount of damage out of our Fle Devastation. The gap between his Fle Devastation and his I-Beam was much smaller, which means that he was deep inside the pack of adds, and his I-Beam and Fle Devastation were both hitting them, whereas just our I-Beam was hitting them and our Fle Devastation was out of range. Now, another way to confirm this is to look at the number of hits. We have 332 hits on I-Beam, compared to his hits 703. This means that we're missing targets with our I-Beam. We're hitting a smaller number of targets, and that's not good for your DPS. You want to be cleaving on as many adds as possible to maximize your DPS and your parse. The same thing for Fle Devastation. 571 hits with Fle Devastation compared to our 231. So this is a big issue. This is a clear, massive loss of DPS. You can see the charts. Fle Devastation should be a much larger chunk of our damage, and it's not. So now we've identified 3 huge points. We've got the Immolation Ore Conduit, which should be doing a lot more damage. We've got the Glaive Tempest, which should be cleaving on a lot more adds. I-Beam and Fle Devastation are being mispositioned, and when they are being positioned, they are not being used on a pack of adds. Instead, they're being used on 1 or 2 targets, which is resulting in a much smaller number of hits across the comparatively longer fight. Now, when you get into these smaller details, looking at these abilities that are lower than your top 5 abilities, it starts being less relevant to look at those. We are looking at a huge gap of DPS, where I'm performing on Sired Anathrius about 50%, whereas this Demon Hunter is performing at the number 1 position, right? He's performing 99 across all Demon Hunters. This means that we really want to be looking at the massive damage pumpers in our kit, as opposed to the smaller things, like whether or not we're lining up Hunt on the maximum number of targets, whether or not we have the exact trinkets that are ideal for this fight, whether or not we have the appropriate, whether or not we're hitting the right number of targets with Metamorphosis. Like, this starts to become irrelevant as you get down here. We really want to get maximum DPS change from one parse to the next, and then when you get up into the 95s, when you start seeing, okay, I'm making incremental progress day over day, then you can spend an hour or two looking at the finer details. Am I hitting the right number of targets with Hunt? Am I getting the maximum damage out of Immolation Aura? Things like that. But I think that basically covers everything that I wanted to talk about today. Keep in mind that there's a lot more detail on these Warcraft log pages that you can take a look at. There's damage taken, healing, as we talked about. There's all sorts of tabs up here. We can also look at timelines. If I wanted to see, okay, when are these abilities being cast from one Demon Hunter to the next, we can see, okay, look, clearly I-Beam is being run at basically the same time, along with Fle Devastation, of course, are associated together. But are we using Glaive Tempest at the right time? We've got 11 seconds on Glaive Tempest there, 11 seconds over here. Okay, these are similar timings. But you can go through this, second by second to see exactly when every single proc, every single ability happened. And that's another way that you can look at, okay, am I using things at the right time? Am I maximizing the number of targets that I'm hitting? When is Sired Anathrius summoning his adds, and am I pressing my buttons at the right time? These timelines, these other, event logs, these replays, this is how you can analyze that data and maximize your DPS. But for the time being, if you just want to get the biggest chunks of damage to increase, from one day to the next, looking at the tables, looking at damage done is where you want to be. You want to look at the top 5 abilities, compare them side by side, and improve them as much as you possibly can before you get into the other smaller details. But that basically sums it up. So thank you guys for watching. Like this video if you felt that it was helpful. Make sure to subscribe for future videos. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks.